Hello and welcome to the Schedule channel, and today let's see if Amazon's best-selling graphics card is worthy of that best-seller label. And if you're curious as to which graphics card that would be, that is none other than the RTX 3060. This is currently occupying 5 of the 10 best-selling graphics cards on Amazon.com, and historically up until this point, the RTX 3060 at its old price tag was generally regarded as one of the weakest performing graphics cards at its price of $350, which was certainly true up until now. Because finally, after months and months of waiting, we finally have the long-awaited price drop for the RTX 3060, which now retails for $290 at its lowest, which is actually not too shabby, which could actually make this finally an appealing graphics card to buy for gamers. If it weren't for AMD's latest entry into the mainstream graphics card market at $250 right now, the RX 7600. So is the RTX 3060 still worthy of that best seller label on Amazon, or is what AMD delivering currently at about the same price, if not less, technically more deserving of that label than the RTX 3060 in the form of the RX 7600? So that is why in today's video, I'll be dissecting the 1080p, 1440p, ray tracing, streaming and gaming recording, and creative application performance of the 7600 and the RTX 3060 in this video to help you ultimately decide on which of these graphics cards should be the best-selling graphics card on Amazon. If you're looking to upgrade from your stock cooler to something aftermarket, then take a look at Cooler Master's new Hyper 212 Halo. This is an update to their legendary 212 series of CPU coolers, now coming in either black or white, while featuring one of their MF120 8RGB fans. Clocking in at a height of 154 millimeters, this should be universally acceptable in nearly any PC case you throw it in, all the while delivering excellent performance. But it doesn't end there, because Cooler Master also wants to show off their new V1100 SFX power supply. This new series of SFX power supplies from Cooler Master can support up to 1300 watts of power, which is unheard of in its class. It features one of the highest power densities on the market, and it's got so much wattage, you can even use it in a standard ATX case with its included ITX to ATX adapter. So with its excellent build quality and really good heat dissipation, it also comes with an ATX 3.0 power adapter. So if you wanted to chuck in an RTX 4000 GPU without any special adapters, you can do that with this SFX power supply. So if any of this interests you, then links can be found in the description below. All right, so here's a quick rundown of the 3060 versus the 7600 spec-wise, and really the one major difference besides this being an NVIDIA and this being a Radeon card is that the 3060 comes with 12 gigabytes of memory with a 192-bit memory bus, and the 7600, which just released, has an 8 gigabyte memory buffer with a 128-bit memory bus. So this has less memory and it's slower. And the over 2-year-old RTX 3060 has more yet faster memory. So does that give it an advantage, especially potentially in higher resolution gaming? Well, we're soon gonna find out. But probably the one major update to the 7600 that make it more appealing, even say over the previous 6600, is the inclusion of the new AV1 codec, which we'll talk about in length later in this video, but that really is going to change the game for the 7600 potential when it comes to content creation, especially for game recording, streaming, and even video editing. So anyways, we'll set aside these two graphics cards and dive right into the benchmarks. So we're going to start with some basic rasterization performance between both of these graphics cards now at Apex Legends at 1080p with everything turned up to the max. Of course, no VSync, no triple buffering. The RX 7600 does have a minor lead, which, yes, that's about a 15 FPS difference, but once you're above 200, you pretty much aren't going to be able to tell the difference, but it does nonetheless have a lead here at 1080p on Apex Legends. But both graphics cards are performing pretty well. Then if we bump up the resolution to 1440p, that same sort of difference is maintained. The 7600 is faster, but once again, I think you shouldn't be complaining with either of these frame rates. Both graphics cards are doing pretty well. But what about a AAA game like God of War from Sony? Well, this running at 1080p at ultra settings sees the RX 7600 win at 1080p at 73 frames per second with higher 1% lows, over the 3060s, 64, and 53. But does that change when we move up to 1440p? Well, here, the 7600 still has a lead over the 3060 with 58 frames per second over the 3060's 53, despite it having 8GB of VRAM versus the 3060's 12GB of VRAM. But then how about Fortnite? Well, this is my weird and intricate way of testing Fortnite in that it's running it on this custom benchmark map, which literally has everything throwing at the player, which should really stress each of these graphics cards. And running at 1080p, both graphics cards are matched. The 7600 and 3060 have the same performance at 1080p with very similar 1% lows. And then going up to 1440p, once again maintaining ultra settings, no ray tracing. Here, finally, the 3060 does squinch out a bit of a lead on the average frame rate. But then let's talk about another AAA game from EA, that being Need for Speed Unbound. And at 1080p, we do have finally a win for the RTX 3060. Here it's getting 95 frames per second about versus the 7600's 87 frames per second. And we see a similar trend at 1440p, although the average frame rate is a little bit closer between the two cards. I would like to point out that the 1% lows on the 7600 are much lower than the 3060s. But then let's switch gears and move over to a DirectX 11 title, that being Total War Warhammer 3. And at 1080p at ultra settings, here the RX 7600 takes the win at 1080p with a higher frame rate on the average and 1% low over the 3060. And then if we bump up the resolution, that same sort of relationship is maintained with the 7600 getting about 52 frames per second over the 3060's 48. So it's been closed up a little bit. But now let's go ahead and talk about F1 2022. And this is at 1080p, no ray tracing, high settings. And here, the 7600 definitely pulls away with a lead on the average frame rate, although the 1% low is not as high as I would like it to be. But I really don't think you should complain when it's at 133.3 frames per second. It's still going to be very high. That said, though, the 3060 is behind by about 40 frames per second with that 194 frame rate on the average. Then if we bump up the resolution to 1440p, the RX 7600 still has a lead over the 3060, this time by about 33 frames per second, and the 1% lows, just like before, are actually kind of similar, but once again, both graphics cards are running either of these games pretty well. Then to wrap up our basic rasterization benchmarks, here's Cyberpunk without any ray tracing at 1080p, without any sort of FPS upscaling from DLSS or FSR. Between both of these cards, the RX 7600 wins at 1080p with a fairly sizable 14 FPS lead on the average. And then if we increase the resolution to 1440p, the 7600, even on a game like Cyberpunk with its 8GB of VRAM, somehow is still pulling over a lead on the 3060 with a 55 average frame rate over the 3060's 46. But now let's talk about ray tracing. And for this, I just have F1 2022 and Cyberpunk 2077. And starting off with F1 2022 with ray tracing turned on. Here, the 7600 and 3060 match on average frame rate. However, the 7600 does have a lower 1% low. But if we increase the frame rate to 1440p, we can probably assume that these graphics cards are about the same in terms of average frame rate. But once again, the 1% low on the 7600 is not looking too good in comparison to the 3060, and I wouldn't be surprised if that is because of the lower VRAM amount. But let's see if that sort of relationship is confirmed in Cyberpunk 2077, where we have it set to 1080p with ray tracing turned on, and here, both graphics cards get about near the same frame rate on the average, and the 1% lows are pretty close too. I know it says high settings, but really that should be ultra settings at the top. And then at 1440p, here the 3060 does eke out a lead, although by about 1.5 frames per second on the average and about 3.5 on the 1% lows. It looks a bit exaggerated on the actual bar charts, but in reality, both of these frame rates are abysmally low. So more or less to conclude the gaming performance on each of these graphics cards, when it comes to pretty much esports, 1080p gaming, striving for the maximum frame rate, I would have to choose the 7600. And then when it comes to 1440p gaming, even then, I think the 7600, despite the lower VRAM, is a newer graphics card, and it's probably going to eke out that performance advantage over the 3060's outdated architecture. And I do want to have a quick note on DLSS and AMD FSR, because both of these graphics cards can take advantage of those FPS upscaling algorithms, and over the last few years, their support has been growing numerously on many PC titles. So in terms of FPS upscaling, you really can't go wrong with either brand, though I guess if you want to be picky about it, as per a recent video from Hardware Unboxed comparing DLSS and AMD FSR, the 3060 with DLSS will be the slightly better looking solution across the board if that is a deal breaker for you. However, one thing I do want to point out is that this RTX 3060 cannot take advantage of DLSS 3.0, which is NVIDIA's frame generation technology exclusive to RTX 4000 graphics cards. And unlike this previous generation of graphics cards, the new one from AMD can actually take advantage of their own form of frame generation coming out. Well, I believe it's out now, but it's not a completely refined. But if you did want to take advantage of frame generation, at the moment, you can only do that on the 7600 with AMD's implementation, whereas NVIDIA has locked it to their latest generation of graphics cards, unfortunately excluding RTX 3000 cards like the 3060. But getting back on track, when it comes to ray tracing, really enough, at 1080p, I'm gonna give it a draw. But in my opinion, you really shouldn't get either of these graphics cards for ray tracing. Just get yourself like a high-end NVIDIA card if you're really about it, like at minimum of 4080 with 16 gigabytes of VRAM, because ray tracing does take up a fair amount of VRAM. And if 12 gigabytes of VRAM is the new minimum, then you probably want a little bit more from ray tracing. So a 4080 at minimum is what I recommend for actually doing proper ray tracing. I wouldn't really get a mid-range graphics card to do it. And even at 1440p, I guess you can give the slight lead to the 3060 because it does have more VRAM, but once again, I wouldn't get either card for ray tracing. But now let's talk about creative applications. And historically, I would pretty much give this category for the most part to NVIDIA because of its CUDA cores and better overall implementation in most creative applications, including game streaming and recording with NVEC. But that is set to change because, like I said earlier in the video, the RX 7600 supports the AV1 codec, and that can allow you to do some really cool things like what you see here on screen. So here on screen is a gameplay recording comparison between the RX 7600 with its AV1 codec and the RTX 3060 with the NVEC codec running at 10 megabits per second. And as you can see here, the AV1 codec at that lower bit rate is showing a lot of quality without too much loss. Even here on NVEC, there's a bit of blockage, as you can see, as the cars are running through on F1 2022, and it's less detailed and less sharp, whereas the AV1 codec is doing a much better job handling and maintaining that quality at that lower bit rate. And why that's going to be really awesome for streaming is because you probably won't need to stream at a really high bitrate anymore to achieve great quality if you choose the RX 7600 with that AV1 codec. And at the moment, YouTube Gaming now officially supports AV1 streaming, and hopefully that'll soon come to Twitch and Kick because, once again, it's a way to get better streaming quality at a lower bandwidth, which will be less taxing on your internet. So for game streaming, I'm gonna have to give the nod to the RX 7600. That AV1 codec is just a new and next generation codec they can only find on the latest graphics cards. So that really is just more kind of a bonus to the 7600 just simply being newer. But still, NVEC is not bad by any means, but AV1 is the future. And that actually extends to video editing as well. If you're a DaVinci Resolve user, then the 7600 should be on your radar because, again, it supports the AV1 codec, and with DaVinci Resolve now supporting that AV1 hardware acceleration, you can really speed up your editing performance with the 7600 with that AV1 codec when it comes to general timeline editing, applying any special effects to your video as you're sort of editing it live on the timeline, or if you just want to speed up your renders, the AV1 codec has shown to be a pretty decent benefit to DaVinci Resolve. However, that's just for DaVinci Resolve. I can't confirm if the AV1 codec support is going to extend to Premiere Pro or other editing softwares. So if you're a DaVinci Resolve user, I really consider the 7600 over the 3060. Well, I would say the 3060 for the most part would be the go-to card, but that AV1 codec is too good to ignore on the 7600. So I take the jump and consider this for basic video editing. But when it comes to all other creative applications that have a really integrated use of CUDA cores found on all NVIDIA graphics cards, like 3D rendering for 3D modeling, or pretty much any AI-based application, if you're one of those niche users, then yeah, of course, the RTX 3060. If you need this graphics card to be a little bit more than a gaming graphics card for any professional work, then the 3060 would be the more useful card out of the two for that scenario. Although I understand that it's a very small percentage of you watching this video, so if you're a gamer and you don't know really where to go for like what kind of graphics card you want to get, I just stick it to the newer and better graphics card that is cheaper by about 40 bucks. So should the RTX 3060 be deserving of that best seller title on Amazon? Well, even with its recent price decrease, no, but somehow people are still buying it. But there's also the new RTX 4060 coming out, which sounds good on the surface, but as seen from the 4060 Ti, it could be a potentially disappointing graphics card. So we'll see how that comes out later this month. But really, the 7600 is here. It's chillin'. It supports some of the latest technology that you'd want if you're a gamer or a semi-content creative professional with that 81 codec, and it outperforms the 3060 for the most part in most gaming workloads that a lot of you who are watching this video will truly care about. Not everyone is going to be running ray tracing on a $200 graphics card, so I think the 7600 makes more sense. So to wrap up things, thank you so much for watching this video, and if you've enjoyed what I've put out so far, then you probably want to like this video because you've made it until this point, and if you enjoy my style of commentating on tech, then yeah, it'd be worth subscribing. I think so. Totally not biased. Anyways, once again, thank you so much for watching, and this is the Scatterable channel, signing out.